sit in
Well,
front.
that's good to know. I mean, well, basically what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to go and try to touch all of our major instruments that we use. You might see a lot in an orchestral, contemporary, or solo setting, and kind of explain the limitations of the instrument and what is generally expected of us on all of these things. First of all, I think it's wonderful that you all are here. I know that writing for an instrument that you don't play is really daunting and frustrating. I write a lot of percussion repertoire, a lot of my own percussion pieces, so I know that struggle of writing for an instrument that you just don't know how it works. But I find that even, well-regarded composers struggle sometimes with writing for percussion. I will play pieces in wind ensemble or orchestra where I see something and I'm just like, that's not how, what? No, it's just like, how does that work? So it's completely understandable. Hopefully I can clear up some of these misconceptions and make the whole process a little bit easier for you. So what I would like to start with is, let's just start with like the big boys, the instruments you see a lot and would probably hear an awful lot. And if you write for, a large ensemble, you're probably going to end up writing for. So let's start back here. Good place to start. The timpani have been a part of the orchestra for centuries. They were originally based on military instruments used by the Ottoman Empire and were originally used to sort of emulate a marching army, right? So very bombastic, very loud. Now generally, most orchestras and most schools, most places in general, will have 4 drums. Sometimes, if it's a lower budget school, they may only have the bottom 3, or sometimes only the middle 2. Which the middle 2 is not a bad problem, because in a lot of classical symphonies, and a lot of Beethoven symphonies, they just have 2 notes on the timpani. But in today's setting, there's a whole plethora of options. Now, the biggest issue I find whenever people write for timpani is that they do not understand the range. I see a lot of people, they'll write for a note that is way too low or way too high. So my general rule of thumb with that is the bass clef is good. Anything that is on the line or in between the lines of the bass clef is reachable, is doable, it's fine, and it's gonna sound good. Now, the lowest drum that most people have is the 32-inch, and it goes all the way down to a D. But as you can hear, it's just kind of a wash of sound. It doesn't really speak. As you'll notice, as I pedal higher, the notes become more clear because the drum is tighter. So that's a good rule of thumb to think about as well. So yes, it can go down to a low D, but it's not really going to speak that well. And that's especially an issue because a lot of composers will write C on timpani, and they'll try to have you play on the 32, which is, don't do that. Please don't do that. Now, some schools have 5 drums. So there's an additional drum right here where the highest note, let me check that, is a middle C. But again, that's very uncommon, and as you can hear, it's a little too tight, so it doesn't quite have that same power. But a C on the 29 in the middle of the staff speaks very loud and clear. And to kind of show you the difference between the drums, on the 29 you have to pedal quite a bit to get to that C, and on the 26 you don't have to pedal that much, so that's not the same note. As you can hear the difference between the pedaling higher and pedaling lower. It's the same note, but this has a little more presence. Now, you may want a darker sound, but that's all to be considered. And last thing I want to talk about with this instrument is that there's a lot of composers that think, oh, you have pedals, you can play bass lines. No. We can, but please don't make us. Like, it's something that generally, and I don't want to say it's like, oh, it's too hard, but like, generally timpanists and percussionists in general are not trained to play melody lines like that. In a pinch, if we have to learn it and practice that, most of us would be willing to, but generally that's not really, ideal for the instrument. For one thing, there's the issue of glissando. So pedal, you can hear that sort of, moving between notes. So if you have, this piece and you want these accentuations, what you should do is you should move it between the drums. Like, maybe if you have a bass line that goes, I don't know, F to E to D. Because of the range of the drum, you might have the F up here on the 29, the E right here, and then have one pedal motion. Sorry. That's not terrible. Or if you want to be smart about it and split it between the drums, like have the F down here, and then have it E right here, that's fine. Just be aware of the motion that we have. It's not as broad as you might think. But timpani's used a lot in orchestra, used a lot in wind ensemble, used a lot in contemporary, and believe it or not, there's a whole lot of solo timpani rep. That's actually pretty cool, so, just something to think about. As far as extended techniques go, generally there's not a whole lot of weird stuff we have to do. I mean, when I think about extended techniques, I think about Elliott Carter's 8 pieces for solo timpani, where he has the player play in the center of the drum, where it's a very dead sound, or play on the very rim. But that doesn't really translate that well, I think, to a large ensemble setting. Something else you could do, and this is neat, is if you take a piece of resonant metal, and you play it, and you pedal the drum, it's kind of warbly sound, right? Now, as cool as that is, the sad thing is it doesn't really carry that far. So if you're going to write this kind of thing, make sure it's in a contemporary setting or a solo setting, because if you do that and, you've got strings doing their thing, flutes doing their thing, no one's going to hear that. So that's something you do have to keep in mind with stuff like this. And one last thing on timpani before we move on.
What if you tremoloed on that thing when you were...
You could, but still not a very loud.
Still not very loud.
Yeah. So, last thing about it is that in some pieces, in some orchestral works, some percussionists play multiple instruments. They may play a drum, they may play a cymbal, they may play glockenspiel. But even in situations like that, the timpani usually plays just timpani. That is their spot, that is their zone. Now and then there may be a suspended cymbal. That's not too difficult of a change to make. But typically you want to give the timpanist their own part because of how involved it is. Anyway, that's all I have for timpani. Any questions about this?
What were the sizes of the 2 smallest drums I missed?
So the 2 smallest drums are, there's a 20-inch and a 23-inch.
Thank you.
A lot of places will have a 23-inch, but 20-inch is possible. And I forgot to mention, the highest note on a 23-inch is an A on the very tip of the bass clef staff. Okay, good. Can we move on? All right. Moving on to a few other commonly used orchestral instruments. I do apologize. This would normally be on a stand or sort of rigged up to kind of be angled this way. But generally, the concert bass drum is played on its side with either a singular mallet or with 2 mallets. Usually play something like this. And generally the purpose is to accentuate these big moments in the orchestra. Either there's a big hit, like in Carmina Burana, where there's massively fortissimo crashing kind of sound, or maybe you're writing a piece that's evocative of thunderstorms and you want to kind of have a little bit of that going on. And by the way, to answer your question why I'm holding the sticks the way I am, there is a difference between matched grip, which is where you hold both sticks kind of like this, and traditional grip, where you hold one of them kind of by the side. This was cultivated in the days when militaries marched with side drums, which were drums like that you wore over your shoulder, and so you would have to hold the sticks like that to play it like that. Generally, you don't really see traditional grip anymore today, except like in marching bands, which is tradition to play snare drum like this. But it is extremely practical on bass drum to play it like that. Again, you hear this a lot in orchestra, in wind ensemble. Not too commonly in chamber ensembles, and almost never in solo rep. There does exist a bass drum concerto, believe it or not, and it's kind of cool actually. But that's
Whose is that?
I forget, but there's a whole lot of cool things you do where like they have a super ball and they rub it across the head and it makes this rumbling sound. It's really cool. But generally, you know, again, with stuff like that, that stuff doesn't really carry over in ensemble. So all of that is stuff to keep in mind when writing for this kind of thing. Now, a surprisingly versatile instrument is this one right here, the snare drum. You've heard this a whole lot, I'm guessing. It's used relentlessly in wind ensemble, in orchestra, chamber ensembles, and there's a lot of solo rep for just this one drum, believe it or not. But there's a whole lot of cool stuff you can do with that. I mean, obviously you got the snares on, playing in the center, but you can also play on the sides. Different sound, as you can hear. You can play on the rim. You can do a rim shot, stick on stick rim shot, move up the stick.
So stick rim shot is when you actually put one
Yes.
stick and then
So
hit the
you
stick.
hold the stick kind of adjacent to the rim like this, and you play on it. Yes.
Can you show us what the snares actually look like?
So this is kind of attached to the stand right now, but like snares, as you can see right there, they're those little metal coils that kind of go across, and snare drum has a little clamp that sort of attaches them to the drum. If you turn it off, it sounds more like that. Yes.
How come a snare doesn't have a specific pitch like the timpani?
I mean, some drums just don't really need that. Typically, drums are just sort of there to, you know, establish a rhythm or establish a hit or to sort of, you know, add a sort of punctuation. Timpani, you know, I mean, maybe it's traditional, but timpani will often play with the bass. They will accentuate a bass line. But when it comes to a lot of these other drums, it's just to accentuate a moment, sort of, or to help accentuate a rhythm. There's not really a pitch involved with a lot of these instruments. But other things you can do with this, you can play with brushes, wire or plastic. I have plastic here. Or with multi-rods or blast sticks. But yeah, in a lot of solo repertoire, there's people, you know, playing with the snares, on and off, making a rhythm out of that, using a multitude of different sticks. You know, kind of creating a Latin sort of feel. But yeah, that's your snare drum. Any questions about that?
So when you turn on and off the snare, does that raise and lower the beats?
Yes. So like they're kind of like connected to the string, right? And if you turn it on, the strings raise and you kind of lock them in place. That's how that happens. And typically, it's easy to turn them on and off, but some drums are a little finicky with that, so it's good to know like what you're asking of the performer to sort of turn on quickly and at will. And also, it makes noise. So, if you want somebody to play with snares off, and then quickly turn them back on, they're going to hear that. So keep that in mind. Any more questions about this? Yes.
How would you notate snare on or off?
You would just write snares on or snares off.
Okay, gotcha.
There's no specific notation. Oh, and I forgot one more thing. A tremolo, if it's 3 tremolos, traditionally, percussion, we see that as a roll. We do not interpret that as 30-second notes. We interpret that's a roll. Okay? So that's how we would see that. If you write 2 tremolos, we get that that's 16s. 1 tremolo, we get that that's 8s. But if you write 3 tremolos, that's a roll. And it doesn't matter what the note it is, if it's over a whole note, quarter note, that's a roll for us. So just keep that in mind. Do you get that that's a roll? Yes. Okay, good.
So you mentioned that there is matched grip and traditional grip. Are those the only types of grips? And
typically, I mean, for snare drum, and other drums, generally that's it. There may be other things that people do, but like we're taught to either play like this or like this. So, I mean, there might be, but they're weird people. So, yeah. So, cymbals. Again, you see this a lot in orchestras. The biggest issue I see when people write for cymbals is that they'll just say cymbal. So to us, we're like, okay, does that mean crash cymbals? And generally, we'll see like one note, we're like, oh, that's crash cymbals. But then they'll have us rolling, and it's like, okay, but we need a suspended cymbal then. So suspended cymbals are generally played with softer mallets, like that, to sort of create a constant sound, right? And obviously, you got a big moment in the orchestra, like that. Or maybe you just want to hold it there. Maybe you just want to give it like this air with this cloudy sound over it. You can also play with sticks, play on the edge, play in the dome, all that kind of stuff. And you can do some cool things with it as well. You may have a sizzle, or you can just connect paper clips together. But if you rest that on top, and you have this big moment in the orchestra, that going on. One last thing, I was going to get to this later, but it is a very cool sound. You know how like when you're watching a movie and like there's these characters that are running through a desert and they're so tired and they look up at the sun? You might hear like that. This is always people's favorite part whenever I get to No, but like, but real quick while I have the bow out, you can basically bow any freestanding metal object. Get that kind of sound going. This also works on glockenspiel, but not that one because it's like in a box. But if it's freely hanging off, you can totally do that. And the crotales, the antique cymbals, they work great with bow. But again, if you want to have this in your piece, make sure that the texture you're using is thin so that it can actually be heard over the ensemble. Just a good rule of thumb there. And of course we come to crash cymbals, which are surprisingly intricate and surprisingly frustrating to play. Because if you're playing a piece and you do this, that's a no-no. That's an air pocket. We hate those. So what you want is a good clean sound between the cymbals. And that's generally how a crash sounds. You can hold on a little longer if you want a really soft crash, but you still want to have presence, like that. Or, very rarely, but I do see this, is a Forte piano crash, where you mute one cymbal and let the other one ring.
So you are muting with your body.
Yes, you mute with your body. You do not mute like that, because that's an extra note, right? And I very rarely see, in marching band, we see this all the time. Yeah. But in an orchestra or wind ensemble setting, you don't. That's not, doesn't really fit the tone of usually what piece is being played right there. Anyway, real quick, this is not a gong. This is a tam-tam. Yeah. Tam-tam sounds like this. So a lot of times when composers write gong, what they mean is tam-tam. This is a gong. This right here. Oh. This is specifically an opera gong. Now, the difference here is that gongs are typically smaller and have a determinate pitch. Like you hear that. But right here, not really. It's just sort of a wash of sound. So just be aware of what you're asking for. And real quick, we'll finish up with the accessories because we just have a few left. Right in here is this, originally used for Latin percussion, but has found a lot of placement in orchestral rep. You can just play regular lines. You can play on your knee. You can play and shake. Maybe there's a big moment in the orchestra we just want to keep that holding. Or you can roll with your thumb. Just so you're aware that there's options. The last thing you might see very often, excuse me, is one of these bad boys right here. It's called a triangle because it was invented by Joe Triangle. That's a lie. Yeah, no. That's what you call a joke. Generally, triangles are played held with one hand so that it's possible to mute if you have to. Kind of like that. Rolls are either played at the top or down at the bottom right. That creates kind of a bigger sound. And if I had another clip with me, what you could do is clip one of these ends to a stand and the other end to a stand, and you can play it with 2 beaters. You have a really, really fast pattern. That's totally possible. Any questions about this smaller stuff that I just talked about?
So when you play tambourine on your knee, do you have like a designated chair that you put your
Yeah, normally you would. I was just ad-libbing right there. But yeah, generally you have a chair to help you out with that. Yes?
So for the tambourine, you said that it's possible to strike it?
Yeah.
And what if you have like 2 notes immediately after, so like 2 8 notes? Is it possible to strike that?
What do you mean?
Like, so you have 1 and 2, so just like that, at that tempo.
Like that? Yeah, sure. Depending on how loud you want it. It's totally possible. Yeah. Questions about accessories? Yes.
So for most of the accessories, will one person play like 4 of those in one song at different times? Or
As long as, so here's the thing. Here's the thing with assigning percussionists multiple instruments. Make sure they have time to get between these instruments, because another huge issue we run into frequently is you've got, you're on marimba, and it's like, okay, crash cymbals, 2 beats later. It's like, can't do that. So just make sure there's ample time. Think about the logistics. Think about the setup of having all this crap out there. Just really, be conscientious. That's all. So, yeah.